Everybody seems to have retreated back to the back of the room, which is fine. But Andrea and that last panel were great, and so I think we should try to keep that same level of energy up. So as we go through, this is the regulatory and enforcement panel, and there are way too many things for our fantastic panelists to just kind of drone on at you about. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to talk about a couple of key issues in the regulatory and enforcement space, but we really want this to be a discussion. I encourage the panelists to kind of crosstalk across each other, but I know there have got to be questions. Each panel has touched on regulatory and enforcement issues. The last panel, we were talking about regulatory and enforcement issues. So I really encourage all of you, if you have a question, please raise your hand, ask it. Otherwise, I'll have to start making up questions at the end. Who knows what I will say. So anyway, so I'm Alan Cohn. I'm the co-chair of the blockchain and cryptocurrency practice at Steptoe & Johnson. And I came to Steptoe & Johnson from the Department of Homeland Security, where I was for about 9 years, and then first encountered cryptocurrency back then. And to borrow my colleague Jason Weinstein's line, largely as an instrumentality of crime, but saw the bigger perspective and have been practicing in this space ever since. And so, like I said, it's too much for us to focus on everything that's going on right now. Sometimes that's, you would think it's good there's only a couple things going on, but I actually think the more that's going on, the more chance of clarity we actually get. So we're in a point where there's enough up in the air where we might actually get some clarity on different things. We're going to focus on the US regulatory and enforcement landscape. All of us are US attorneys, and so we're going to put aside the discussions of MiCA or MiFID or the regulatory regimes in Korea or Japan and some of the interesting enforcement activity that's going on in those places and the differences in enforcement in the EU and elsewhere, and just focus on the US. And it's interesting, I think that one of the things that always strikes me when we think about this space is that when we think about technology development and regulation, the post-war period, post-World War II period was full of government innovations coming out, or technological innovations coming out of government labs. Military, civilian, government labs, and government had a lot of time to think about how to regulate technology before it commercialized. For the last 20, 30 years, that just hasn't been the case. And this space in particular has been a good example where regulators have really been trying to catch up to innovations, to technological, operational governance innovations. And it's difficult for everybody in the space. So we have a great panel to talk to you about this. Just by way of brief introduction, all the way opposite me is Carol Van Cleef from partner Bradley Arendt, one of the early attorneys in this space, deeply knowledgeable, been through the wars, great fonts of information, and is going to talk to us about kind of the general landscape. Gary Weinstein is next to her, the Chief Regulatory Officer at the Electric Coin Company, which all of you know of as the kind of DevCo and supporter of Zcash. And we'll talk about some of the privacy and privacy-enhancing technology issues going on right now. Gabriel Benincasa, partner in Holland & Knight, former SEC Chief Risk Officer. I'm going to start out with a little discussion about what's going on in Congress right now. But every discussion about regulatory and enforcement issues in this space quickly brings us to securities law issues. So I'm sure Gabe will be someone you'll want to ask some questions of. And then finally, Jason Weinstein, who's my colleague and co-founder and co-chair of the blockchain and digital currency practice at Steptoe, also chairs the Blockchain Alliance, nonprofit organization whose purpose is to bring industry and government together to talk about fighting criminality in blockchain. Former official at the Department of Justice, former federal prosecutor, and we're going to talk a bit about some of the enforcement, investigation enforcement activities. So with that as an overview, let me pass over to Carol to kick our discussion off.
Thank you. I do better with a handheld anyway. So thank you, Alan, thank you for a very kind introduction. These kinds of discussions are always difficult because, as Alan just said, you end up talking about securities in some way. But the problem we've got is we've got a lot of different issues that are out on the table. And we have a lot of different kinds of assets. So when we talk about securities, we're talking about one type of crypto asset, or maybe a few flavors of crypto assets that might fit into that category. But we've got other kinds of crypto assets. So the way I like to do it, and I think it's easy to visualize it, is think in terms of buckets. We have one bucket, I'm gonna have 6 buckets, 5 buckets, whatever it is that I'm gonna fill as I go through this. The first bucket is the native currency. That's really one that's reserved for Bitcoin and, I don't know, couple dozen of maybe a few more, where the cryptocurrency, the crypto asset is an outgrowth of the blockchain, the technology, the algorithm, whatever the methodology is for creating the crypto. The second bucket, as I'm going to just call it right now, and some of this is sort of evolutionary, but I'll say it's the tokens. Say the ERC20 token standard gave rise to what ended up causing or becoming the foundation for initial coin offerings, ICOs. But that bucket right there divides into a variety of buckets. So some of them may be security tokens, some of them may be utility tokens, some of them may be, there's probably, somebody can come up with a dozen different terms for them, but where there's some sort of functionality related to the token that's being issued. So let's put those tokens in a bucket and we'll come back to them. Then we've got this class of crypto assets that's evolved over the last several years called stablecoins. And I know that you had some discussion on that earlier today. But stablecoins perform a different kind of a function in the system, but they're working off of the same technology rails that we're dealing with. And then whether you want to put into that bucket, I would put into the next bucket central bank digital currencies, which is certainly an area where we're going to be hearing increasingly more about it. And then I have a bucket for DeFi. Now, to be honest with you, that bucket's pretty big and pretty messy. And can be broken down in a bunch of different ways. But right now, if it says DeFi, let's put it into that bucket and let it be there. And then finally, we've got the category of NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And have you talked much about, I apologize because I've been off at other meetings. So this is, non-fungible tokens are probably the area that's going to drive, besides stable coins, the greatest level of adoption of crypto assets and the technology at the end of the day. And they're going to be used in a wide variety of areas. So even though we're putting NFTs into that particular bucket right now, that bucket really can contain a bunch of things like DeFi. It can be pretty messy. But once you get them into those categories and start thinking and talking about that helps the conversation significantly, because too often we do gravitate right to the issue of security. Something's a security, and then the whole conversation becomes dominated by that. Now, a little bit about my background is that I was a banking regulatory lawyer, right out of law school here at AU, and I learned very early on in working with banking clients who were at a period, early days of the technology really taking hold, of coming up with new products and services. And so we always looked for an analogy of something else. It was always better to go into a regulator talking about something that looked like something that had happened before, and maybe we push it another step along the way. But to walk right into a regulator and say, give us approval for something, or let us do this, or don't get angry if we do this because it's brand new and never been done before, doesn't usually fly, especially in Washington. So when I got into crypto, and I sort of got in through a back door of dealing with a gold-backed digital currency system that ended up getting prosecuted by the US government in 2008. So that was, well, sort of the same year that the Satoshi Nakamoto, and I shouldn't say sort of, it was the same year that Satoshi Nakamoto released their paper. But what was interesting, there was so much to learn from that case, and still much to learn from it. And one of the things that the government at the time was pushing for was, first of all, they wanted to send the founders of the system to jail. Part of it was they were using terminology nobody had ever heard about. You know, what's a crypto exchange today? We all sort of know, Coinbase immediately comes to mind, right? They were talking about digital currency exchanges, and they were talking about concepts that now we take for granted that nobody had ever heard about before. And it was just this mystery world. And it was very difficult to have a conversation. Now, I wasn't involved with them. I was hired on the backside of the federal prosecution. I should have said that from the beginning. But when they were prosecuted, the Department of Justice went in for the maximum sentence for the founder of 10 years in jail on money laundering charges. At the end of the day, he got an ankle bracelet and 6 months to wear it. What they said to the judge when she said, "Why are you pushing for this sentence in the way it is?" The judge said, "Because we need to set out a set of rules, a new roadmap for this wild, wild west of digital currencies and what it means for international remittances." So in 2008, we had a foundation that was laid, and we had actually a roadmap for regulation. So needless to say, when I got into the crypto world and started really going to the crypto conferences, my first one was in 2013, and I got up and said what I had to say about regulation, I sort of got booed out of the room. And I was disinvited to conferences subsequently because of what I was telling people when I got up and said, I don't care whether you're a money service business or not, that's, you know, sort of overlays some of these buckets. You still have federal criminal statutes to be worried about. And I was disinvited and never been invited back to that conference since then. And it's in Miami in January. So that's enough of a background, and we can come back and talk about other issues.
So there you go. So you have buckets. We can think about those buckets, right? Of course, but the problem is that native protocol tokens or governance tokens for DeFi or tokens that run on top of protocols like ERC20 tokens or SPL tokens, none of those have any legal foundation, right? None of them are defined in law. None of them, especially in the U.S., those terms are not kind of almost relevant to U.S. law. Instead, we've been subjected to analysis of, as we've been talked about in the different panels, the Howey test, the Gary Plastics test, the concept of the managed investment scheme, or the investment contract. And so after as many years as well, Carol, everyone's been in this, Congress is now starting to grapple with this question and say, and actually try to define in and define out, you know, what exactly are we talking about from a characteristics and functionality perspective when we talk about securities versus commodities, and we'll talk a bit about the overlay of other things. So Gabe, maybe can you talk a bit about kind of maybe where we are and then what's going on in Congress to try to address this? You sat out of order, so.
So hi. So let me just, I actually got to the crypto world a little late before I get into buckets. So what happened was, before I joined the SEC, I'm talking to my son and he starts telling me, Dad, I'm trading Bitcoin. And I'm like, you're trading what? He's like, I'm trading Bitcoin. I'm like, how the hell are you getting into this? And now I got to start paying attention. So I put up, I won't name the platform. So I put up the platform as he's trading. So, and I kind of quickly realized it's got about $1,000 bid offer spread. Now, in the securities world, we have markup and markdown rules. It would violate those rules. Commission's pretty high as well. I'm like, wow, this is a great industry. markup rules don't apply, commission rules don't apply. They're gonna take me out of business. So, but that was my introduction to the crypto world. And then I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I could not trade Bitcoin or any other crypto. But about a year ago, I joined Holland and Knight, and I've actually been advising, probably not too well, and a lot of clients on the crypto space. But I've been following the recent legislation, and there's really kind of two major bills. There's the Loomis-Gillibrand bill, and then there's the Stabenow-Boozman bill. What's interesting about both those bills is the commission that I formerly worked at has been out there saying we don't need new regulations, we don't need new legislation. We have a lot of guidance, and it's really under the purview of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Interestingly, both bills take the view that most assets are commodities. So if you look at the pool that they would put them in, it's commodities, not securities. The Loomis-Gillibrand bill is a lot more comprehensive, and it goes into an incredible amount of detail. And really, they would set up a structure pursuant to which I would call it like registration light. You could register the asset in a very kind of a simplified way without having to do an S3 or an S1 registration statement, and it would trade on an exchange governed by the CFTC. Now, the CFTC has a lot less people, a lot smaller enforcement, but it also will be brand new for the CFTC because the CFTC governs trades and futures. This will be the first time that they will govern trades on a spot market. So it's changing the entire regulatory scheme. The Stabenow-Boozman bill, again, also takes the approach that most of the assets are commodities. Again, has the same kind of trading structure. Not as detailed. The other interesting part about the bills is they both give digital assets the same status as a commodity or a security under the bankruptcy code. That basically puts it under what I call the protected contract provisions of the bankruptcy code, so that people could take self-help remedies even though you have an automatic stay. So those are some of the benefits. The other interesting provision that's in the Loomis bill, it's not in the Stabenow bill, is an accounting provision. We may get into this later on, but the SEC issues something called Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, which requires digital assets to be on balance sheet as opposed to off balance sheet where they are now, and where the securities held in custodian are held off balance sheet. The Loomis-Gillibrand bill completely reverses the SEC Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. But those are some of there's also stablecoin provisions. There's a lot going on in the regulatory world.
So what's interesting about those two is, of course, it's a big fight over what type of investment asset a digital asset is, which of course leads you to the question of, well, is it an investment asset at all? Isn't it a use asset? Isn't it an asset for use and consumption rather than just for trading and investment? So on the one hand, there is a battle of how should these assets be regulated, which in the United States really means which, as Gabe said, which regulator is going to regulate. This is different from most other countries where you have an integrated financial regulator, and this doesn't have to be the issue. The issue can really be the attributes of the asset, or the attributes of the platform, or the attributes of the network. Now, cutting across that, as Carol noted, is the Treasury Department, which took a different tack because it could under its regulations, and said, we don't really care if it's an investment asset or an asset for use. You, the industry, have been very clear that this is meant to be an asset that behaves like currency. We have rules about currency. Follow those rules. And that was actually a very useful starting point. Certainly doesn't cover the waterfront, certainly being challenged by aspects like decentralized finance and decentralized exchanges and self-custody of assets, but it's a good starting point. But what it also means is that, separate and apart from any question about whether this is an investment asset or a spot or a future or anything like that, is that there are obligations with respect to anti-money laundering and with respect to sanctions compliance that much of the Web3 world needs to be cognizant of, if not actively compliant with, depending on different attributes of the issuer and network and protocol, et cetera. Noted on an earlier panel was the Tornado Cash action. And it's probably worth pulling that apart a little bit, talking about what it is, what happened, why it's relevant in a couple of directions, with respect to sanctions compliance generally, with respect to sanctions compliance and privacy enhancing technology, and, as was noted on the last panel, with respect to sanctions compliance and validation, with staking, self-censorship, and and the question of whether regulation goes so far into goes as far as actually into block formation, as opposed to just the receiver or sender of assets. So, Jason, let's start with you to talk about, just give an overview of what happened in Tornado Cash.
See if this is working. Now it is. So before I do, let me step back about 20,000 feet. And I should say my intro to crypto was taking over the computer crime section at the tail end of the case that Carol was talking about. And Carol, there's no shame in representing people who are under a criminal investigation. I do it every day.
No, I was after.
I know, but even if you had done it before, everybody's innocent until proven guilty. Those guys were super guilty, but everybody is innocent until proven guilty. So before I talk about OFAC and sanctions.
Prosecutors always say that.
They always do. Now I'm a defense lawyer, so I say they're alleged. Everything's alleged. Carol described the buckets for the different types of assets, and the regulators fall into buckets too. But if I can switch the metaphor, I prefer to think of the regulatory landscape in the U.S. as kind of a Venn diagram from hell, where you've got, it's commonly said by kind of the less informed observers of the space that crypto's the Wild West. I think it's the opposite. There's too many sheriffs in town, or there's a lot of sheriffs in town, and each one thinks that they're in charge. And what this creates is a dynamic where companies that want to color inside the lines don't know where the lines are. And they've got an agency like FinCEN that tells them where they believe the lines are, at least for the things that are within their jurisdiction, and then otherwise they're reading speeches and in between the lines of congressional testimony to try to figure out what some of the other agencies think. Two agencies that transcend that Venn diagram and have their footprint over the whole thing. I'm going to destroy that metaphor, but two agencies that loom over everything are DOJ and OFAC. And OFAC most recently in the Tornado Cash action that Alan mentioned. So as I think everybody knows, on August 8th, OFAC designated decentralized mixer Tornado Cash as for the sanctions list. And they included not just the entity that operates the front-end website of Tornado Cash, but they also included the URL address for Tornado Cash's website, and more controversially, they included certain virtual currency wallet addresses that are associated with Tornado Cash, and I very much mean the air quotes. And those are the addresses for the Mixer smart contract. The allegation underlying the sanctions action is that Tornado Cash was used to launder about $7 billion of virtual currency since 2019, including about $500 million stolen by the Lazarus Group, which you may have heard of as a North Korea-backed hacking group. By the way, the Lazarus Group, the bad actor here, was actually already sanctioned. They were sanctioned in 2019. The case is groundbreaking in a number of ways, none of them particularly good. It's the first time that OFAC has sanctioned an on-chain decentralized protocol, as opposed to a discernible individual or entity whose action they can cause to change. Tornado Cash is decentralized, it's open source, it's a piece of software, and it's not like other mixers that OFAC has gone after, like Blender.io, which is a real entity that controls the mixer and that can change the way it operates in response to the sanctions. The entity that launched Tornado Cash, which presumably is the same entity that operates the website, but I don't know if others do, but.
And the Twitter account.
And the Twitter account, right. Although that may just have been reducing Twitter accounts may just be a contribution to society. But the entity that launched Tornado Cash has no control over the smart contract. They can't control how it works. They can't control who uses it. They can't decide which customers to take and which customers to reject. And in response to this, entities in our ecosystem took a number of actions. Some exchanges blocked accounts that were previously interacting with Tornado Cash addresses. GitHub went so far as to suspend Tornado Cash's account and that of its founder. There were these dusting transactions you may have heard about where some folks who, either as a form of protest or as an object lesson in the futility of all this, sent small amounts of crypto from wallet addresses associated with Tornado Cash to Jimmy Fallon, to Dave Chappelle, to a number of other companies to make some sort of stupid point. And more significantly, it raised a lot of substantial statutory and constitutional and policy questions that have been highlighted really quite nicely by Coin Center, by EFF, and by some other groups. Fundamentally, they're arguing that OFAC exceeded its statutory authority because its authority is to sanction persons or entities, and this is neither. It's a piece of software. They also raise constitutional questions, both free speech and due process. The free speech question is, they're essentially limiting the ability of innocent users to use freely available, publicly available software to maintain their privacy for entirely legitimate reasons. And I should say, Elliptic, which has studied transaction activity involving Tornado Cash addresses, says that some 80% of the activity on using Tornado Cash addresses is legitimate. And as Gary, no relation, but always happy to have another Weinstein in the space, we'll talk about, privacy is legitimate. It is not sinister. And privacy is normal. And this is a lot of the activity that's prescribed here now was legitimate activity, and you're limiting the ability of people to interact with software. The due process issue relates primarily to the fact that there were users, innocent users, using Tornado Cash addresses and using the mixer for legitimate purposes on August 8th when the action was taken, who all of a sudden had no access to their funds and could not interact with those addresses to get their funds back without in turn violating sanctions. But the policy questions were just as significant as the statutory and constitutional ones. It seems antithetical, at least to me, to the typical US government statements you hear from DOJ, from Treasury, from every agency with any equities in this space, that we don't regulate technology. We regulate illicit uses of the technology. It's hard to square that with this action. And one of the privacy groups, I can't remember which, but it was a terrific analogy, compared it to sanctioning the protocol used to send emails in the early days of the internet because email was being used by criminals or by cyber criminals or used for phishing. Now, yesterday, you may have seen OFAC release some FAQs to try to address some of these concerns. And credit to two of our colleagues, Evan Abrams and Dave Stetson, who's an OFAC alum, for some of these observations. OFAC drew a distinction between the open source code and transactions with Tornado Cash, apparently attempting to push back on the First Amendment concerns. So they have assured us you can look at the code, you can publish the code, you can copy the code, you can talk about the code, you can teach about the code, and you can include the code in a textbook. That's all reassuring to know the First Amendment still applies. But I don't think anyone was seriously suggesting that they were prescribing that activity. With regard to the dusting transactions, they didn't go so far as to say you're not required to freeze the dusting, what you receive in the dusting transactions, but they did say that they're not going to make a priority of enforcing the failure to report those transactions. And then finally, for people who are unable to get their crypto to deal with the due process concern, they said that those folks can apply for what's called a specific license, which is a license to engage in a specific transaction that OFAC has to bless in advance in order to get your crypto back. There was some hope that OFAC would give a general license, which is, as the name implies, kind of broader authority to continue to engage with Tornado Cash, but they did not do that. And so they're trying to reassure people that they can get their crypto back if they go through the process, which is not a simple process. The big picture takeaways, and I think of greatest relevance to our discussion today, is OFAC's not backing down from the assertion that it has the legal authority to engage in enforcement against smart contracts. And fundamentally, they're continuing to commingle the concept of the entity that launched Tornado Cash with the smart contracts that allow it to operate. And and there's already a legal challenge. You may have seen that Coinbase is underwriting a lawsuit by 6 users challenging the action on some of the grounds that I've been discussing. But what it tells us is that regulators like to hold people accountable, and they're uncomfortable in a world in which they can't find that person. And so that applies to the entire DeFi space. When a regulator can't figure out who they can serve a subpoena on and who they can hold responsible for what they consider to be improper activity, it's an uncomfortable environment for them. And while they previously have not issued any guidance related to DeFi, OFAC's action here, I think, lays down a pretty important marker. It makes clear that OFAC is going to target projects or protocols that are engaged in what they consider to be illicit activity, regardless of the degree of decentralization. And that means that developers of decentralized protocols have to think about sanctions enforcement more than ever before. And that's especially concerning because OFAC, it's always hard to fight City Hall. It's probably hardest to fight City Hall when City Hall is OFAC, because you don't get to fight them until after the fact, after the action is taken that has harmed your business or put your business in jeopardy. It's a more opaque process than other agencies, and criminal violations often can follow. If there's a willful violation of a sanction, that could be a crime, and so you could be dealing with OFAC and DOJ at the same time. So bottom line is we have a long way to go to educate regulators about the fact that you can have an environment where innovation can thrive and you can have decentralized finance, and the US can be an engine of economic growth, and you can protect consumers and public safety at the same time. But that requires a degree of engagement that was certainly not present here.
So can I come in with a different side of this? Because as soon as I saw that release come out on that Monday morning, first of all, I think I read the release more closely than most people did, because buried in the release was a statement to the effect, and I should have read it before I came here, so I had it down pat, but essentially that Tornado Cash, and they referred to as Tornado Cash, had made promises to essentially clean up their act with respect to the money laundering that was going through Tornado Cash. So that's why I went to Twitter. That's why I knew the Twitter account was out there, the Tornado Cash Twitter account. And sure enough, in April, a tweet had gone out from that account, whoever was behind the account, and said, we're now using Chainalysis. They inserted it someplace into the process, one of the blockchain analytics tools. And the press release went on to say, basically, they hadn't delivered on what they were supposed to do. So we had it was, yes, definitely an extraordinary act. But again, when you layer onto this, does it make any difference to you that this was a major vehicle for helping move money that was, or value, that was acquired by the North Koreans in connection with ransomware attacks that are costly, that have been affecting US citizens and so on? So, I think that the Treasury, my guess is the Treasury Department looked at probably a variety of different kinds of options, and in the best way that this industry is known, or the space is known for disruption, they decided a little disruption on their part to try to take care of the public policy, public good issue.
Well, no, and I think that's a very important, that's a obvious kind of elocution of the policy goal. And I don't think anybody would debate the policy goal. The challenge comes, of course, pulling it back, right? I mean, SWIFT was used by the North Koreans to rip off the Central Bank of Bangladesh for $81 million. So, so it's not really the question of the vehicle, but even if it is the question of the vehicle, one of the important things that got conflated here is Tornado Cash, the front end, versus Tornado Cash, the smart contract or the protocol through which funds move. And the reason why that's important is because if you think across the DeFi environment, right, there's a lot of entities that look like that. There are a lot of foundations, front ends, development companies that operate websites, front ends, discretionary front ends by which you can use previously coded protocols, but by which you can access through other mechanisms. I think all of us can probably think of different entities within the DeFi space that operate like that. And so the question becomes, what is the industry to read from holding the line on, one equals the other? But I'm not really the person to talk more deeply about this. Gary, I want you to talk more deeply about this, and also kind of this question about privacy and privacy enhancing technology more generally.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, first of all, thank you to GBBC, Sandra especially, and Summer and Riley. Thank you so much. I know it's a large team there. It's been a pleasure getting to chat with many of you during the breaks. And for those on the live stream, I'm happy to respond if anyone wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Before I get into some background information, I'd like to first, we're at a Web3 summit. I'd love to read to you, if you don't mind, my favorite Web3 quote. So my favorite Web3 quote is, "The United States should ensure that safeguards are in place and promote the responsible development of digital assets to protect consumers, investors, and businesses, maintain privacy, and shield against arbitrary or unlawful surveillance, which can contribute to human rights abuses." The author of that quote, President Biden, in his March 2022 executive order. And I think what this points out, and these are not the words of my CEO, Zuko Wilcox at the Electric Coin Company, but it's one of the clearest examples of how we can see the strength of the public-private partnerships that can be developed in this industry. It's rather critical, actually. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background, if it's okay. I've been practicing law for 28 years. I started out as a regulator. I was an antitrust prosecutor, prosecuting international horizontal price-fixing conspiracies. I was an antitrust lawyer for many years. This was with the state of New York, where I had a really golden opportunity to cut my teeth in the federal court system in the Southern District of New York and Eastern District of New York. After 7 years there, I had an opportunity to join a national financial services company where we developed products for the unbanked. So throughout my entire career, I've really focused on financial inclusion. In addition, and at the same time, so at that company, I was managing the regulatory, the litigation. I was chief privacy officer. I was elevated to acting general counsel for a period of time. And one of the most exciting opportunities I had was to be on the board of directors as treasurer and secretary of a 501c6, which developed products for the unbanked, and where we were frequently on the Hill educating regulators and working collaboratively with our valued law enforcement partners and regulators to stand up these very important products to foster financial inclusion. And we also stood up, I think, the second ISAC in the history of the United States to combat identity theft refund fraud. So I worked collaboratively with Commissioner Koskinen and his team at the IRS, with criminal law enforcement in various agencies at the United States government. And together, as an industry, we figured out ways to combat money laundering and the illicit activity of nation-state actors who were looking to launder money through stolen identities and tax returns. And hopefully, at the end of the day, we saved the United States government tens of billions of dollars in prevented refund fraud. At one of the offsites, we invited a two-star general who was responsible for NORAD to lecture to us about blockchain. And 2018 obviously was right after the ICO blowups, and while I can't get into the details of the meeting, it was something that was ultimately career fascinating to me, trying to figure out how blockchain and distributed ledger technology could change the world. I am privileged and lucky to be head of global regulatory relations for Electric Coin Company, and we are looking to change the world. Privacy is normal. Thank you, Jason. Yes, it is normal, and it's something where this balance with fostering innovation and making sure the United States can be a home for this valuable innovation, can coexist and work quite well with our valued regulatory partners. When you think about it, and it's not too controversial an idea, but transparency is actually a national security threat. And let me just bring it to the local example. If I send a digital asset to somebody, it cannot be in a modern society, an advanced place, where everybody gets to see that transaction. And that's presently what occurs generally on the blockchain. It's a public distributed ledger. We heard a little bit from the last panel about how immutable it really is, and I think that was some pretty valuable insight. But my mayor, my employer, my friends, my family should not be able to, with the push of a few buttons, plug in my NFT Ethereum address, or perhaps the Bitcoin address that I use to send that digital asset, and see my balances. If I'm proud of an NFT and I publish that or attribute it to me in some way on social media, people shouldn't be able to see that I also own Gala, for example. It just cannot be how modern society works. Competitors, when they are purchasing resources for their company on the blockchain, and that will happen, it's already happening, they should not have to reveal to other competitors in the space what they're doing. They need to be the industry leader and compete. Again, getting back to solid antitrust principles as well, in terms of competition actually benefiting consumers at the end of the day. So what does Electric Coin Company do, and how do we contribute to this international conversation about privacy is normal? Well, we created and support Zcash in an open source way, a protocol that solves this privacy dilemma. We facilitate a privacy-preserving cryptocurrency. It's referred to as ZEC, Z-E-C, for anonymous value transfer using something that we sometimes refer to as moon math, but we can talk about it as zero-knowledge cryptography. And the protocol facilitates options for transactions to be either shielded, and that's also referred to as anonymous, or transparent, which is visible, on the Zcash blockchain. And it's really, if you think about it, the consent of the individual. I might want to, for very good reasons, send a digital asset to an individual where I want it to be transparent. Maybe I'm contributing to an organization where it's valuable or needed or required that that digital asset transfer be transparent. But maybe, just maybe, I'm in a state where I am purchasing a medication where it is now illegal to purchase that medication. And perhaps at the time that I did it, it wasn't illegal. And that's something that's really important to remember. All of the activity, all the data that we are leaking on these publicly distributed ledgers might be fine now in this country. It's not in a lot of countries. But there may come a time when the state in the United States that we live in decides, oh, that activity is now illegal. And all of this sort of future jeopardy that we're putting ourselves in really needs to be thought through. And I think the last panel did a tremendous job talking about how even governments, and I had this issue working in government, it's very, very hard to keep our servers and our databases secure, and they're hacked all the time. So when we think about developing CBDCs, for example, are we really, with that level of transparency, putting our national security interests at risk? And because our platform and what we contribute to is open source, people are free to take our technology and go do grand things with it. At the end of the day, if it's not Electric Coin Company and Zcash that's successful, and it's some other use case on some other blockchain, that's great. We are a public charity in that sense. It is our mission to contribute to the social good, And if at the end of the day that is the social good, that our technology with our zero knowledge proof cryptography allows for these grand use cases to be realized, then I think we would have and will have accomplished our mission.
A little walk through some of the current some of the ways of thinking about the regulatory environment, some of the current enforcement actions. Way more that we can talk about. However, I want to see what questions that you have for our panelists. Andrea.
You'd mentioned two overreaching or overarching additional agencies we haven't thought, well, we've thought about, Justice and OFAC. What about the CFPB? Because we're all talking about protection of consumers and issues around that. So to me, that looms large. Just wondering what you think.
Yeah, I can start with it at least, is that, first of all, CFPB has a limited charter in terms of what it can focus on. So it can't focus on securities and it can't focus on insurance. What it does focus on is financial services, financial institution products and services. So in some ways, to the extent that we're moving crypto assets into buckets that are not those buckets, oh, this you, okay, not a bucket that's a financial institution product or a financial services product, it's not going to be subject to the CFPB jurisdiction. However, and this is something that's been lost significantly by the crypto space, is that the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, does have jurisdiction to protect consumers under Unfair and Deceptive Practices Acts. And I think that's where we're probably going to see the next major regulatory foray into crypto. There have been some minor cases in the past, but I think this is where the time is now where we're going to start to see more of that activity.
Thank you. Now I turn it back on. Just to follow up on that. But just as the SEC hasn't seen a digital asset, every asset is basically security, it could be that the CFPB, it's about a matter of labeling, right? So they could see those crypto assets as within their jurisdiction.
Right. Other comments? Pull back for a moment and think about it, because this is a question that I think, if we think about the way that the industry thinks about itself, sometimes gets lost. Whether it's the consumer financial product that the CFPB regulates, whether it's the retail product that the FTC regulates, the SEC has two policy goals, right? Investor protection, market integrity, right? But nowhere in there is consumer protection, user protection, the user who's not the investor, the user who's just a user. And so the question is, are regulators missing the third leg of the stool? And if you think about for those of you who've read The Pocketful of Quarters, No Action Letter, hidden in the incoming is that Pocketful of Quarters has two tokens. One that investors buy, accredited investors buy them, and they get a 15-cent scrape on every dollar of Ether that goes into their smart contract. And that's totally lawful because they are investors, so they can get a return on their investment. And then there's the company, the issuer, right? And they are regulated. That's a Reg D offering of the sale of that Q2 token because it is an exempt security. But then third are the people who use the tokens for the games, the people who just buy the Quarters token using their Ether going through the smart contract. They first get 15% of their value scraped off the top, and then they can't ever take their value out of the platform. They have to spend it there, and then others, game developers, investors, marketers, promoters, they can then take the Quarters and cash them back out. So is this concept of user protection or consumer protection getting lost in an overarching focus on market integrity and investor protection?
I'll jump in on that because I spend a lot of time in and around those issues. And I think the answer is that they may have been lost because they haven't had the advocate in Washington necessarily on on the scene paying attention to it the way maybe it's time. Maybe it's just as we're coming to the point that it's time for that to happen because we have more people in and more value in and more at the retail level. We have seen state attorney generals, we've seen the state securities commissioners be very active and bridge this gap. I do think that, and I think, Andrea, maybe where you were coming from is if you're looking at DeFi, and I have to remember that's the world you're in now, is that DeFi almost by definition, lending, yield earning type of accounts that don't fit into securities could very well be CFPB value. But for the game token, that may be more likely to be in the FTC's jurisdiction. So I would argue that we've got the waterfront pretty well covered here. It's just whether the regulators are showing up and doing anything.
Yeah, see, you talked about tornado cash. And so my question is, what's the answer, right? Where's the balance between privacy and national security? There's always that question. And so the government's not going to just say, okay, we're going to just roll over and go away. There's got to be some kind of solution proposed. And then I was just going to say that I think that there's been a lot of focus on the SEC and the CFTC. I like the 8 buckets, but you really have to have us rolling with the alphabet soup of regulators, and you need to be someone, there's not that many lawyers who, I have a little experience in everything, Carol probably does too, from working on the Hill on all the different issues. Then you just take this. Now sometimes it's, it's all how you structure the product, right? We have an entire financial services system almost now in the crypto universe. You can match most of the things that are going on happen today. Some of the things that are going on do not happen today because of reasons that we've decided that it's not safe and sound or, a variety of reasons. Some of the transactions are new and maybe agencies would be willing to approve a new product, right? So I think that my point is, I look at them and I just think of, my chart of all the different agencies, and you have to think OCC, FDIC, not just, you got to think about the Fed, Treasury, they may grab everything and say it should be regulated like a bank. So I think I think you have to have that whole thing in front of you, and then you can and be able to navigate that thing. And because, SEC, everyone's so scared of SEC, Gensler will leave at some point, right? I can tell you SEC regulation is nothing compared to Federal Reserve regulation.
Right. And of course, getting your business
Appreciate that, right?
and getting your business unwound is really terrible and hurts a lot, but it's better than jail. So, and don't forget the states, right? So this is the Venn diagram from hell, right? And the operational art of practicing law in this space.
That's right, and it's everything you said and worse, because sometimes in trying to comply with one agency's regime, you could end up violating another's. So, it's just one simple example. There's a degree of centralization that an OFAC or a FinCEN would want to see in order for you to be able to reliably implement a compliance program for AML and sanctions. But that degree of centralization could be what tips the scale, is the one brick in the wall that the SEC needs to consider your offering to be a security. So you absolutely have to have the whole diagram in front of you. And what we tell clients all the time when they come in asking about one of those acronyms, one piece of the diagram, is we tell them you've got to actually look at the entire diagram to make sure that what you're doing is, creates the most reasonable approach to the risks that all those different agencies present. But the fact that you need a diagram of that complexity is part of the problem.
Well, it is for most attorneys who only, they're very expert in their area, right?
Oh, no, it's good for attorneys. It's only good for attorneys.
It's good for attorneys.
Right.
You have to, what I've seen is from, ICO craze, all the talk to me, they were all diagnosable. Capital raise combined with sale of a service, right? But most of them was that, right?
Yeah.
Now it's if you have a client
100%.
Work with the national security. No. Okay, now we're dealing with money transmission. Okay, I'm working with the. Okay, you have to be able to, and I think like at some law firms, not the bigger ones, the ability to do that is just not there. Or there are people who just say, I'm a blockchain attorney.
That's right.
And there's no blockchain attorney. It's like it's a technology. It's like being an internet. It's like a weird,
Right.
That's 100% right. In
And-
fact, you know,
So
10
we,
years ago,
we have a regulatory panel. This is a business school event, not a law school event, right? I just want to make sure that we're talking to the right audience, because I could definitely jump in on that question, and I fully understand that because I've definitely
Right.
made comments publicly on that before.
Well,
Yeah.
right. And that's the clients who can afford
Right.
to hire Paul Hastings or Steptoe or Holland and Knight or Bradley Aaron. I mean, it's becoming that it becomes the maze makes access to reasonable and and knowledgeable advice on how to navigate this thicket almost inaccessible. But I want to go back to your first question, which is so what's the answer? And is that even the question? Is the question, because this is something we used to debate at Homeland Security all the time, is there a fundamental tension between privacy and national security? Or is that a false tension? Do these things necessarily have to live in conjunction with one another? I think, Gary, you're a natural person to maybe pick that up.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to find an answer today in the 30 seconds we have left, but I would say that this is eminently solvable. We have the innovation, we have the technology, we have the best intentions of law enforcement and government regulatory bodies to be able to find and strike that balance where we are not chasing blockchain and distributed ledger technology to some other country, to some other actor who is not high integrity like all of the people who are attending this summit, and where we will find ourselves jeopardizing the security of society. So we need to secure society. We need to think about how privacy is normal. We need to work with our partners in government to try to solve the very, very difficult issues that they are solving and trying to maintain the national security of each individual country that they're charged with protecting. And I think when smart minds with high integrity individuals get together, we can solve this.
New. Every single time there's a leap forward in technology, law enforcement freaks out, especially if it's privacy enhancing, and the sky is falling, might as well shut down, turn in our badges and our guns, we're never going to solve another crime. And then they adapt. They typically, by working with industry, to find a solution that achieves public policy objectives, privacy objectives, and commercial objectives, and law enforcement objectives. That's how it's been done all the way back to the cell phone, the encrypted communication on the internet, WhatsApp, Signal, what have you. When I was at DOJ, I sat in so many of these meetings about what they used to call going dark that I occasionally would go dark myself. And the fact is those problems are solvable. Gary's 100% right. They're only solvable, though, if government and industry work together to solve them.
Is that it really, we're talking about assets in buckets, but what happens is it's not making a clear delineation and saying, only you, the CFTC, have it. Because it says, well, if it's a security, it goes back to the SEC. So you're going to have a land grab. What you need is a regulation which says it will go to one place and they'll have exclusive, and so you don't have all the lawmakers heaping in. And let me just, so you were talking about how regulators, get afraid when it's something new. That, or technology. I don't know if you watched the Elvis movie, but the regulators or the police got nervous when someone performed differently and they threatened to put him in jail. So it's somewhat similar, and it happened, this is in the 50s. So,
Carol, last word?
I'm going to say national security will trump, and that's a bad choice of words, but privacy at the end of the day. However, I think what's exciting is we're right there with a whole bunch of new types of technology tools, some of which are born directly out of what we're talking about here today, that will help in trying to bring those two objectives together in a way that they can coexist.
Perfect. Well, thank you. That's all the time that we have. Thanks for your questions. Thank you to the panelists. Look forward to the rest of the day.